Hi, I'm Raya. I just got back from a work trip, expecting a quiet evening. But instead, I heard my husband whisper, "How do we kick her out?" And then I saw her, my mother-in-law, smirking like she already had it all planned. When I walked in, she sneered, "Sign it, we already did." They thought they could control me, erase my voice, and take everything I've worked for. But I wasn't going to let them win. So I did something they never expected. Could you imagine being cornered in your own home and knowing you had to fight back in ways they'd never see coming? I had just returned from my week-long work trip, exhausted and unaware of what awaited me. The Houston sun had barely dipped behind the skyline when I stepped into my home, my mind still buzzing with the details of client meetings, conference calls, and the endless stream of emails I had left unattended. The familiar scent of my living room, the faint aroma of vanilla candles my husband liked, was supposed to be comforting. Instead, it felt like a prelude to betrayal. As I placed my coat on the rack and kicked off my heels, I heard it, a hushed whisper, barely audible, yet chilling in its intimacy. "How do we kick her out?" My blood ran cold. I froze, listening, my pulse thudding audibly in my ears. My husband, Mark, the man I had trusted with my life, was plotting against me. Before I could even process the words, I heard another voice, smooth, deliberate, dangerous. My mother-in-law, Callista. "Don't worry, I've got a plan." The casual smirk in her tone was enough to ignite a storm of anger and disbelief within me. I stepped quietly closer, pretending to be absorbed in placing my work bag on the table, but my heart was pounding. I had known for years that Callista had her own opinions about me, but to hear her actively conspiring to remove me from my own home was a level of betrayal I hadn't anticipated. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them, to explode with righteous fury. But I stayed calm, letting the moment simmer in the back of my mind. There would be time for strategy later. I entered the kitchen, pretending to be unaware. The warmth of the evening light through the windows did nothing to soften the chill in my bones. Callista's eyes met mine, and the smirk never left her face. "Sign it," she said casually, holding out a folder. "We already did." The legal document she handed me was deceptively ordinary looking, a piece of paper that could upend everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed. The words leapt out at me: authorization, eviction, transfer of ownership. My hand shook, but I steadied it, taking the folder as if it were an everyday task. Inside, I could see the lines that had been written to remove me from the home I had built, from the life I had invested in, from the family I had tried to protect. Callista leaned back, crossing her arms with that infuriating air of superiority. "It's easier if you just sign," she said, her voice silk over steel. "We can avoid unnecessary conflict." Her words, meant to intimidate, instead lit a fire inside me. Rage, humiliation, disbelief, they tangled in my chest, demanding expression. And yet, I stayed composed, carefully controlling my face, hiding the storm that raged within. Outwardly calm, inwardly planning, I began to think through the threads I could pull, the leverage I might find, the ways I could turn this betrayal to my advantage. I thought about my husband. Mark wasn't cruel by nature, but complacency and a desire to avoid confrontation had always defined him. It took me a split second to realize he wasn't the architect here. He was merely a pawn, a hesitant accomplice in Callista's scheme. That knowledge gave me some comfort. His hands weren't entirely dirty, yet he had been complicit, and that would have to be addressed. I glanced at the corners of the room, scanning for allies, for clues, for any small sign that someone might be on my side without revealing themselves. Perhaps my sister-in-law, Elowen, had a conscience. Perhaps one of the neighbors had noticed Callista's manipulations. Small threads, but threads nonetheless. Even in betrayal, the faintest glimmer of hope could be the spark of survival. Sitting down at the edge of the kitchen counter, I opened the folder, carefully reviewing each clause. The words blurred as my mind raced. Every line was a trap, every signature a surrender of rights I had never expected to lose. But as I read, I also began to formulate my response, not impulsively, not emotionally, but strategically. Callista thought she had me cornered, but she hadn't accounted for the quiet determination that had always defined me. I had endured condescension, criticism, and subtle undermining for years. This would be the culmination, but also the turning point. "I suppose it makes sense," I said aloud, my voice steady but laced with controlled venom. "If you think this will make life easier for you, fine, I'll sign." Callista's smirk widened, her eyes gleaming triumphantly. But as I traced the pen over the final signature line, my mind was already several steps ahead. Plans, contingencies, countermeasures, I considered them all in a rapid cascade of thoughts. Every deceit she had woven could be untangled, every maneuver anticipated. Once the pen left the paper, the air seemed heavier, charged with unspoken tension. I placed the folder back on the counter with deliberate calm, keeping my expression neutral. Inside, though, a storm brewed. Strategies, alliances, and counterplots forming a lattice of intention that would one day bring her carefully crafted plan crashing down. The evening light outside deepened into twilight, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I poured myself a glass of water, letting the cool liquid anchor my racing thoughts. Every betrayal, every manipulation was now a challenge I would meet head-on. I had learned over the years that life didn't reward those who cowered quietly. It rewarded those who endured, adapted, and struck with precision when the time was right. As I sipped my water, I recalled all the nights I had stayed late at the office, the moments I had sacrificed for family, the quiet support I had given Mark, even when he didn't ask for it. Those memories were bitter and sweet simultaneously. Reminders of my commitment and fuel for the resolve I now nurtured. The document was signed, yes, but this was not surrender. It was a tactical pause, a moment to gather strength and insight. I glanced once more at Callista. Her expression was smug, but she didn't know the storm gathering in the shadows of her victory. The family dynamics had shifted, silently and irreversibly. I would move carefully, invisibly, with purpose, leveraging every resource, every connection, every hint of weakness. I set the folder down and stepped to the window, looking out at the Houston skyline, the city lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. The world felt vast and indifferent, yet within it, I would carve my path. Betrayal had been revealed, humiliation had been served. Now, strategy and patience would dictate the next chapter. I would rise not through anger alone, but through calculated action. As I sat alone in my bedroom, memories of past betrayals flooded my mind, each one sharpening my resolve. The evening light spilled through the curtains, casting long shadows across the walls, yet inside me, everything was illuminated with painful clarity. I thought about the times I had trusted family members blindly. Mark, my husband, who always seemed hesitant to confront conflict. Callista, whose subtle manipulations had simmered beneath polite smiles for years. Even distant relatives whose opinions had once seemed harmless, now revealed as tiny threads in a much larger web of deception. Every flashback intensified my simmering anger, though outwardly I remained composed. I had learned long ago that rage shouted loudly in private, but must whisper strategically in public. I reached for my phone and scrolled through messages, pausing on one from my sister-in-law, Elowen. Her words were brief, almost cryptic. "Meet me tomorrow. Alone. I have something you need to see." A small spark of hope ignited. Perhaps she was my ally in this tangled maze, though caution whispered that even a single misstep could undo everything. I placed the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, letting the softness of the pillows absorb some of my tension. The quiet of the room was deceptive. It only made the echoes of betrayal louder. I opened the folder again, rereading the eviction documents with painstaking attention. Something I had missed earlier caught my eye, a subtle clause tucked between the legal jargon. It was a hidden maneuver, a financial lever that gave Callista and Mark far more control than I had anticipated. The words trustee authority, temporary transfer of assets. Each phrase sent a shiver down my spine. The implications were serious. It wasn't just about being kicked out. This could compromise my financial independence, my professional credibility, and even my ability to maintain custody and influence over decisions in my own home. My stomach tightened with the realization. They had planned meticulously, using layers of legal and personal leverage to trap me. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I closed my eyes, drawing a deep breath, and reminded myself that panic would accomplish nothing. I needed a strategy. Every step, every move from here on had to be precise. As I considered the possible responses, a quiet knock at the door startled me. It was Elowen, slipping into the room with cautious eyes. "I couldn't just sit back," she whispered, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might betray her. "I've been watching, listening." "You need to know, they've gone deeper than you realize." She handed me a small envelope, thick with papers, and I felt the weight of unspoken trust. Opening it, I found records of past financial transfers, emails hinting at collusion, and notes pointing to Callista's network of influence. My heart pounded as understanding dawned. This was not just a family squabble, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound between us. "You have to be careful," Elowen cautioned. "One wrong move, and they'll know you're onto them. And if that happens—" Her voice trailed, but the implication was clear. I nodded, acknowledging the risk without showing fear. That was the first rule. Never reveal the depth of your awareness until it's time to act. Once she left, I began planning. Notes on a legal pad, secret calls, discreet emails. I mapped out the beginnings of a counter-strategy. Each detail had to be subtle, every gesture calculated. I thought about Mark, wondering if he could be swayed to my side or if his fear of confrontation would keep him pliant. And Callista, her confidence was dangerous, but she underestimated my patience. I would gather evidence, document every deception, and prepare for the moment when strategy could overtake sheer audacity. Later that evening, as I moved through the living room to make myself a cup of tea, I encountered Mark in the kitchen. His eyes flicked toward the signed document on the counter. "I know it's not exactly fair," he murmured, scratching the back of his neck. His voice held a tension I recognized, guilt mixed with apprehension. I met his gaze calmly. "Fair has nothing to do with it right now," I said softly, letting the words hang. "What matters is who acts wisely." He nodded, unsure, hesitant, leaving me with the sense that while he might be hesitant to confront, he was not entirely lost. I spent the next hour moving through the house, gathering small evidence, checking files, and noting inconsistencies in the plans laid out by Callista. Every drawer, every folder, every detail became a potential piece of the puzzle. The late afternoon sun deepened into early evening, casting golden streaks across the floorboards. I made a mental note of the times when Callista would be distracted, when Mark would be absent for meetings, when privacy would be absolute. Small windows of opportunity, but enough to begin a counterplay. As night settled over Houston, I felt a quiet satisfaction in preparation. My anger had been tempered by calculation, my shock transformed into purpose. The house seemed different now, charged with tension, each creak and hum a reminder that the next steps would require finesse, intelligence, and courage. I could feel the shift. These hidden agendas were no longer just theirs. I was aware, I was ready, and slowly, carefully, I would reclaim control. Before heading to bed, I jotted down one last note. Observe, document, strategize, execute. Simple words, yet the framework for everything to come. I turned off the bedside lamp and looked out at the twinkling lights of the city, drawing strength from the ordinary evening outside, while inside, a storm quietly built. Early the next morning, I made my way to the office, determination blazing in my chest, ready to confront what had been quietly brewing. The city was already stirring, the sun glinting off the glass buildings as cars honked and people moved with familiar urgency. My mind replayed the events from last night, the hidden clause, the documents, Elowen's warning, and each replay sharpened my resolve. I knew I could no longer wait for others to act. I had to reclaim the narrative of my own life. Before leaving my apartment, I paused by the mirror, adjusting my blazer and smoothing my hair. My reflection stared back at me, a woman both weary and resolute. The exhaustion from travel and emotional strain tugged at my eyes, but I refused to let it show. Each step toward the elevator was measured, purposeful. As I descended, I mentally rehearsed how I would speak to Mark, careful to temper the intensity of my emotions with strategic calm. Rage and composure, I reminded myself, were a delicate balance. Too much of either, and the advantage could slip away. The drive to the office was short, yet I felt the tension coiling like a spring inside me. Each red light seemed longer than it should, each honk and engine rumble amplifying my anticipation. Once I parked, I lingered for a moment, observing the familiar faces of colleagues bustling to their tasks. Everything appeared normal, yet I knew the undercurrents of my private storm would soon surface in this public arena. I stepped out of the car, feeling the warm, late-morning sunlight on my face, a stark contrast to the cold calculations simmering beneath. Inside my office, I arranged the documents on my desk, the ones I had meticulously examined with Elowen last night. I checked the emails, the financial records, the subtle traces of manipulation, and then took a deep breath. Today was not just about confrontation, it was about establishing presence, demonstrating that I would no longer be pushed aside. The office door clicked open, and Mark stepped in, carrying a coffee cup and wearing that habitual expression of hesitance I had grown to recognize. He paused, eyes briefly meeting mine, sensing that the air between us had shifted. "Raya, can we talk?" he asked cautiously, setting the cup down. I gestured for him to sit, leaning back in my chair as if the tension were mine to control. "Yes, we need to talk," I replied, my voice steady, deliberate. "I know about the plan. I know the details. You need to explain yourself." The words hit with precision, leaving little room for denial. I watched him falter, that brief flicker of guilt passing through his eyes. He had not anticipated that I would uncover so much before confronting him. Mark swallowed, adjusting his tie nervously. I didn't think you'd see it this way. "I was trying to protect you from complications," he murmured, though his tone betrayed uncertainty rather than reassurance. "Protect me? From what?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly, my fingers resting on the folder that contained every document, every proof of intent. "From yourself? Or from your mother?" His hesitation told me more than words could. This was the first crack in his composure. The subtle power shift was beginning, and I intended to press it with tactful precision. Before he could answer, the sound of deliberate heels echoed down the hallway. Callista appeared, poised and unnervingly composed. She smiled, but there was a coldness behind it, the kind that suggested she had anticipated this confrontation. "Morning, Raya," she said, her voice smooth but sharp. "I see you've discovered a few things." She extended her hand toward the documents, her eyes narrowing with subtle menace. "Perhaps it's best we discuss this privately, somewhere less public." The threat was veiled, yet the implication was unmistakable. I recognized the maneuver. She wanted control of the narrative, to intimidate me into submission. I refused to let her. "No," I replied firmly, keeping my tone neutral, carefully measured. "We are discussing this here now. No behind-closed-doors theatrics." My words hung in the air, an assertion that I was not intimidated. Callista's eyes flickered for a brief moment, surprise mixed with irritation. She had underestimated my composure, my readiness to face the situation head-on. Mark shifted uncomfortably, caught between his mother and me, his loyalties stretched thin. I sensed the tension, the invisible lines drawn in the office space, each of us maneuvering within them. "Raya," he began, but I cut him off gently, a firm but calm hand raised. "Let's not waste words. I have read everything. I understand the financial implications, the legal leverage, and the attempts to control me. You need to hear this clearly. I will not be moved without a fight." "And you," I said, my gaze turning to Callista, "will not manipulate me with intimidation or threats." The room felt charged, silent except for the distant hum of office activity outside. Callista's poised demeanor remained, but I could see the subtle tightening of her jaw, the small flinch that betrayed the effectiveness of my words. I had introduced doubt, and that was enough for now. As the morning wore on, I began discreetly gathering evidence, emails, phone logs, financial records. Each action was subtle, inconspicuous to anyone observing from the hallway. Every call I made, every document I copied, reinforced my strategy without drawing attention. I was patient, meticulous, and aware that the stakes were escalating. Elowen's earlier warnings echoed in my mind. One misstep, and all could be revealed prematurely. I had to act like a shadow in my own home, invisible, yet potent. By late morning, the tension reached its peak when I quietly slipped a small folder into my bag, a collection of evidence carefully curated for future leverage. Each piece represented a thread of truth I could pull to expose deception when the time was right. Mark's glance met mine once more, the silent acknowledgement that he knew I was no longer passive. And Callista, sensing the subtle shift in power, smiled once more, but it lacked the confidence she carried in the past. I left the office with a composed expression, but inside, my mind raced with calculations, possibilities, and contingencies. Each step along the polished hallway floor was a beat closer to reclaiming control, a careful negotiation of presence and strategy. Houston's late morning sun streamed through the windows as if illuminating my resolve. I felt the thrill of calculated risk, the tension of impending confrontation, and the quiet satisfaction of action finally taken. As the late evening sun dipped below the Houston skyline, casting long shadows across the living room, I sat at the dinner table, the silence between us thick and suffocating. Each glance exchanged carried unspoken threats, hints of betrayal, and veiled hostility. The family home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battleground, the air charged with tension that made my chest tighten. I placed my fork down, exhaling slowly, gathering my composure before I spoke. Tonight, I would not be passive. Tonight, I would assert myself. "Dinner's ready," my mother-in-law, Callista, said, her tone sweet, but loaded with an edge I recognized instantly. She glanced at Mark, who avoided my gaze, shifting uneasily in his chair. It was as if the entire room waited for me to falter, to reveal a fraction of doubt or hesitation. I took a moment, letting my calmness settle over the table like a shield. I wouldn't let them see fear. Not tonight. "I appreciate dinner, Callista," I said evenly, my voice soft but firm. "But we need to have a conversation." The words were simple, yet deliberate, like laying the first stone of a foundation. She arched an eyebrow, a faint smirk teasing her lips, assuming she held the upper hand. I knew she expected me to be defensive, reactive, but I had already prepared for this. Callista leaned back, pretending casualness, yet her eyes were sharp. "Oh, and what is so pressing that it can't wait until after we eat?" Her words dripped with the subtle poison of guilt and expectation. She was skilled at making people feel indebted, weaving past favors and family loyalty into invisible chains. I had felt these chains before, but tonight I was determined to break them. I met her gaze steadily, allowing a pause to emphasize my resolve. "I'm not here to play games or to be manipulated," I said quietly, but the firmness in my tone was undeniable. "I know the pressures and the plans that have been set against me, and I am setting my boundaries now. I will not be intimidated, and I will not be made to step aside from my home or my family." For a moment, Callista's mask of politeness faltered. I caught the flicker of irritation, a tightening around her mouth that betrayed her surprise. She quickly masked it, taking a bite of food as if the conversation were trivial. Mark shifted uneasily, fidgeting with his napkin. I sensed his internal conflict, the subtle questioning of his mother's intentions. He had seen the determination in my eyes during the office confrontation, and it seemed to have unsettled the carefully orchestrated family dynamic. "You always think you're right, don't you?" Callista said, her words smooth, carefully measured. "You've always had this streak of independence, but independence has its price. Have you considered the debts you owe, familial obligations, sacrifices made over the years?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, a visual cue of the trap she hoped I'd step into. I let her words hang, unshaken, allowing the tension to build in the silent space between us. My mind was calculating, replaying the subtle cues I had noted earlier, measuring the risk of escalation. "I am aware of my responsibilities," I replied, each syllable deliberate. "But I am also aware of my worth, my contributions, and the limits of manipulation. I honor my family, but I will not be coerced into surrendering my rights or my dignity." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I felt the shift, the subtle tightening of control that she attempted to exert. but I had prepared for this. I had considered every angle, every possible leverage point. I knew that words alone could be both weapons and shields, and I wielded them with precision. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the balance of power was shifting. Mark finally spoke, his voice low, hesitant. "Raya, maybe we should talk about this later." There was a weight in his words, a crack in his usual placidity. I recognized it as a sign of doubt, evidence that my previous confrontations had begun to unsettle the carefully constructed plan. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling understanding but maintaining my composure. Now was not the time for impulsive actions. Now was the time for calculated assertion. I glanced at my youngest nephew, quietly observing from the end of the table. Even he seemed to sense the tension, a curiosity in his eyes that mirrored the uncertainty of loyalties in the room. These subtle observations informed my strategy. I could use perception, patience, and timing to reinforce my position without overt conflict. My every movement, every measured pause, contributed to the psychological landscape I was shaping. Callista's attempt at manipulation had faltered, but she was not yet defeated. Her next words were softer, more insidious. "We only want what's best for you, Raya. Don't let pride blind you to what's already been provided. Surely you understand that family comes first." The classic guilt play. I met her gaze without flinching, acknowledging the attempt but refusing to succumb. "I understand family," I said, my tone even, "but I also understand respect, boundaries, and fairness. I am part of this family, but I am not a pawn in anyone's game." A hush fell over the table, the room heavy with anticipation. Even Mark's shifting had ceased, the gravity of my assertion settling in. I felt the subtle change, the first tremors of recognition that I was no longer passive. The dynamics had shifted. Alliances, hesitations, and resentments became visible, small but tangible, weaving the intricate web of power that I could now navigate. I allowed a pause, letting the weight of my words resonate. The subtle silence was more telling than any retort Callista could offer. Then, with deliberate calm, I rose from my chair. The movement was fluid, composed, a silent signal that the evening and the power within it was no longer under their control alone. I gathered my napkin, placed it neatly beside my plate, and moved toward the door. Each step was measured, echoing slightly in the quiet of the house, a quiet proclamation that I was in command of my own narrative. I opened the door, pausing briefly to glance back. Their faces mirrored a mix of shock, hesitation, and reluctant acknowledgement. The moment was subtle but potent, the first assertion of my autonomy, a clear statement that I was prepared to act, to resist, and to reclaim control. As I closed the door behind me, the echoes of their murmurs lingered, a shadow that would follow them, and me, into tomorrow, a quiet promise that the battles ahead would be deliberate, strategic, and ultimately mine to navigate. The morning light spilled across the living room, soft but revealing, as if it had a mind of its own. I could feel the tension in the air. Every step I took toward the living room felt like walking into a storm, each tile echoing beneath my heels like a warning. The previous night's dinner had left its mark. Callista's icy gaze, Mark's subtle hesitation, the unspoken realization that I had begun to reclaim some measure of control. Today, I would take the next step. I entered the living room with careful precision, my movements deliberate, nothing rushed. The documents I had collected yesterday rested securely in my hands, a folder of carefully compiled evidence that would serve as both shield and weapon. My pulse thrummed steadily, a reminder that fear and determination could coexist without one overpowering the other. I inhaled deeply, allowing the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee to settle my mind. This was my home, and I would not be intimidated. "Good morning," I said evenly, my voice calm yet carrying an unspoken authority. Callista, seated on the far sofa with a cup of tea cradled in her hands, raised an eyebrow, her expression a blend of curiosity and caution. Mark, standing near the window, shifted uneasily but didn't speak. The subtle tension in the room was palpable, a test waiting to be taken. I approached the coffee table and placed the folder down deliberately, the soft thud marking the beginning of a confrontation I had carefully prepared for. I think it's time we address a few things, I said, letting my gaze move deliberately between them. There's no need for games or veiled threats. I know what's been planned, and I am not here to be passive anymore. Callista's smile tightened, a thin line betraying her composure. Raya, you always have a way of dramatizing everything, she said, her words smooth, measured. We're simply trying to guide things in the right direction, for the good of everyone involved. She leaned slightly forward, a subtle attempt to assert dominance, but I recognized the strain beneath her practiced calm. Mark shifted, his posture betraying uncertainty. Raya, maybe you're misreading things, he said quietly. We just want stability, that's all. The hesitation in his voice was undeniable. He was testing the waters, unsure whether to stand with his mother or confront the growing reality of her manipulation. I met their gazes steadily. No, Mark, I said clearly, my tone unwavering. I am not misreading anything, and I am no longer willing to let hidden agendas dictate my place in this family. Callista, I respect you, but I will not be manipulated or silenced. I am reclaiming what is rightfully mine. The air shifted. Callista's fingers tightened around her teacup, the subtle tremor betraying her surprise. She had expected resistance, but not the level of calculated calm I now displayed. I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the first crack in the facade she had meticulously maintained. She leaned back, her voice sharper, carrying the weight of years of control. You really think you can just step in and undo decades of family expectations? You think it's that simple? Her words were designed to provoke, to make me flinch, to reassert the hierarchy she had long dominated. I let her words hang for a moment, then slowly opened the folder, revealing documents, receipts, and notes carefully organized. It may not be simple, I said, my eyes unwavering, but it's reality. The decisions I am making are informed, deliberate, and grounded in facts. I have been patient, but patience has limits. I will not allow deceit or manipulation to dictate my life any longer. The room fell silent. Even Mark, usually so composed, seemed caught off guard by the clarity and precision of my actions. I had exposed the plan without raising my voice, without dramatics, simply by presenting undeniable evidence and speaking with measured conviction. The power dynamics were shifting before my eyes. Callista's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing, calculating the next move. You're clever, I'll give you that, she said finally, her voice low, almost admiring yet tinged with irritation. But cleverness doesn't erase influence or history. Be careful, Raya, the house isn't yours yet. The subtle threat was there, but now it was balanced by my evident preparation. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without fear. I understand, and I am prepared for what comes next. My mind raced ahead, plotting discreet maneuvers and contingencies. I could anticipate their moves, but they could no longer anticipate mine. My patience, my intelligence, and my observation were my allies. I took a slow step toward the home office, the space where so many of the past schemes had been devised. Each step I took felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that I was no longer passive. The office door loomed ahead, a symbolic threshold. Crossing it would mean taking control not just over documents, but over the narrative, over the space where decisions were made. Mark hesitated in the doorway, a flicker of conflict in his eyes. Raya, are you sure about this? He asked quietly. It wasn't a question seeking permission. It was recognition of the change in power, acknowledgement that I had become an active force in the household. I paused, looking back at them. Callista's gaze was sharp, calculating, but behind it was a subtle uncertainty. I smiled faintly, calm, assured. Yes, I said simply. I am sure. And from this point forward, I am in control of my choices, my space, and my family's respect. Everything else will follow. With that, I stepped into the office, closing the door gently behind me. The sound was final yet soft, a punctuation mark on the confrontation. From my vantage point, I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps and murmured discussions beyond the door. They were plotting, undoubtedly, but now I had the upper hand, I had provoked with precision, and I had responded with strategy. The first strike had been made, and I was already planning the next. I leaned against the desk, the folder before me like a shield and blueprint simultaneously. Each document represented insight, foresight, and leverage. The room, the house, the dynamics, all were now under the scrutiny and guidance of my mind. The shift was subtle but irreversible. My heart still thrummed with adrenaline, but it was tempered by clarity, by the knowledge that I could act decisively without chaos. As I walked toward the front door, preparing to leave for a brief moment of clarity and reflection, I could hear the whispered plotting behind me. The voices were low, cautious, laden with the realization that the passive target they had assumed I was no longer existed. And in that moment, a plan was forming in my mind, a sequence of calculated steps that would ensure I retained not only control, but respect, authority, and peace within my home. By the time I stepped into the driveway, I knew that the next confrontation would decide everything. The Texas sun hung low, slanting long shadows across the pavement, and I could already sense the charged atmosphere waiting inside. The quiet murmurs from last night still echoed in my mind, a reminder that the family's subtle plotting had not ceased. Every glance I exchanged with Mark, every step I took toward the house, carried the weight of calculated purpose. I had to anticipate, react, and strike, all without betraying a trace of panic. As I opened the front door, the familiar creak of the hinges felt unusually sharp. I paused to take a deep breath, reminding myself that composure was my greatest weapon. The living room was empty, but the faint scent of Callista's floral perfume lingered, a subtle signal that she was already nearby, preparing her next move. I set my keys down quietly and moved toward the kitchen, noting how the sunlight caught on the edge of a broken vase, a remnant of yesterday's unspoken tensions. Even small details seemed orchestrated, as if the house itself were a witness to the undercurrents of betrayal and scheming. "Raya!" Callista's voice called out from the far end of the kitchen, smooth but edged with steel. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." She leaned against the counter, hands clasped lightly, her posture deliberate. Every detail in her stance was a signal, a provocation meant to unsettle me. She wanted to see me flinch, to manipulate me into stepping into a trap. "I thought it best to be here," I replied evenly, keeping my tone calm, unshakable. I let my eyes sweep across the room, noting the slight tremor in Mark's jaw as he stood silently beside the refrigerator. The tension between him and his mother was almost tangible, an invisible line of friction that mirrored the one I now occupied. Their plan to isolate me would only work if I allowed it, and I wasn't about to grant them that satisfaction. Callista's lips curved slightly, an almost imperceptible smirk. "You do have a way of keeping things interesting," she said. "But you must understand, control isn't just about documents or declarations. Sometimes it's about knowing when to yield." Her words were carefully chosen, a subtle attempt to guilt and intimidate, but I had anticipated this. Every word, every hesitation was part of a strategy I had already mapped in my mind. I stepped closer, placing my hand on the edge of the kitchen counter, grounding myself. "Control isn't about yielding to manipulation," I said softly but firmly. "It's about recognizing deceit and refusing to let it dictate your life. I am not here to negotiate fear or uncertainty. I am here to reclaim what is rightfully mine, and I won't back down." My gaze locked with hers, steady, unyielding. I could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the first sign that my calm assertion had unsettled her plans. From behind, I noticed Mark's hands clenching at his sides. He wanted to intervene, to mediate, but his uncertainty kept him frozen. The household had always depended on his tacit compliance, yet now he faced the reality that loyalty and deception were tangled, and the consequences of siding with his mother, or against me, would soon become evident. He shifted slightly, hesitating, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Callista exhaled sharply, her composure faltering for a moment, revealing the first crack in her facade. "You really believe you can navigate all this without making mistakes?" she asked, her voice a mix of warning and challenge. She moved toward the dining table, deliberately brushing against scattered papers, symbols of past conflicts, seeming to gesture at the chaos she hoped would unnerve me. I allowed a small, strategic smile to form. "Mistakes aren't my concern," I replied, my voice steady. "What matters is clarity, preparation, and action. Every move I make is deliberate. I've anticipated your efforts to isolate me, to sway my decisions, and to trap me into signing away control, but you underestimated my awareness and my resolve." I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small recorder, holding it casually on the countertop. The subtle click of its activation was a statement. I had proof, I had witnesses, and I had leverage. Her eyes widened slightly, a fleeting sign of alarm. She had assumed that fear or manipulation would keep me compliant, but the recorder and the careful documentation it represented flipped the dynamic. Mark's gaze flickered between us, a mixture of surprise and guilt forming. Even his own uncertainty became a testament to the shifting balance in the room. You've been planning this," Callista whispered, almost incredulously. Her tone carried both astonishment and frustration. She had underestimated not only my intelligence, but my ability to act decisively, to convert their scheming into an advantage. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, charged with the potential for confrontation. I could feel my pulse quicken, yet my voice remained calm, my mind focused. I stepped back, allowing my presence to fill the room. "Yes, I have," I admitted. "And I will continue to do so. Every attempt to undermine me will be met with observation, strategy, and response. This is no longer a silent battle. From now on, everything will be transparent, and nothing will catch me off guard." My words were measured, yet they carried the weight of authority. Every member of the family could sense the shift, the realization that I was no longer a passive participant, but an active force in our household. Voices stirred in the background, siblings entering the room, cousins lingering near doorways. Their subtle reactions, whispers of doubt, and side glances created micro-alliances, revealing loyalties and resentments that had long simmered beneath the surface. Mark's hesitation grew, torn between filial duty and emerging awareness of my resolve. Callista's composed mask had slipped, if only slightly, but I knew she was already calculating the next stage of her response. I moved toward the sliding glass doors leading to the backyard, the late afternoon sun casting warm golden streaks across the floor. I paused, feeling the gravity of this moment. Every step I had taken, every word I had spoken, had escalated the tension to a boiling point. The confrontation had reached a stage where control was no longer symbolic. It was actionable, measurable, and within my grasp. The family members present could sense it. Their next moves would define the course of our household's dynamics. I turned slightly, looking back at the kitchen, at the subtle yet palpable unease etched across Callista's face and Mark's conflicted posture. I didn't need to speak. The message was clear. I was aware, prepared, and in control. Any attempt to manipulate or intimidate me would be met with the consequences I had meticulously planned. The sun's fading light mirrored the closing of one chapter and the anticipation of the next, signaling that the time for measured patience was ending and the stage was set for decisive action. As the final rays of sunlight slanted across the backyard, I inhaled deeply, feeling the surge of determination that had been building within me. This was the moment where strategy, courage, and resolve converged. The household had been shaken, alliances were forming, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges. But I was ready. Every glance, every movement, every whispered word had brought me to this threshold, and I would not step back. The moment had come. I couldn't let another day pass without confronting the lies and schemes that had poisoned my family. The house felt heavier tonight, as if the walls themselves remembered every whispered plan, every deceitful glance from the past weeks. Walking through the living room, I noted the scattered legal documents from earlier attempts at manipulation, reminders of the tension that had been building like a storm cloud over our household. The dimmed lights cast shadows across the furniture, giving everything a somber, charged feel, and I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as Mark moved nervously behind me. I paused at the threshold of the home office, glancing over the papers that I had carefully organized earlier in the day. Every document, every record, every carefully collected piece of evidence was more than just ink on paper. It was a shield, a weapon, and a key to restoring both dignity and balance. I had prepared meticulously, knowing that my mother-in-law and husband would attempt one last gambit to intimidate me. I could feel the weight of expectation in the silence, the unseen eyes of the family waiting for this confrontation to reach its peak. Callista stepped into the doorway, her posture flawless, her expression composed yet calculating. "Raya," she said, her voice almost sweet, almost innocuous. "I was hoping we could resolve things quietly tonight. There's no need for further embarrassment." But her eyes betrayed her, sharp, alert, and wary. I recognized the subtle tremor of uncertainty. She knew she had underestimated me. "Embarrassment?" I echoed, keeping my voice steady. "The only embarrassment here has been the deception and manipulation that has taken root in this household. Tonight, we clear the air, and nothing will be left hidden." I spread the carefully curated documents across the desk, letting the rustle of paper punctuate my words. "Everything you and Mark have attempted, every scheme to control finances or silence me, is documented and accounted for. I suggest you take a moment to consider your next move carefully." Her composure faltered, just slightly, as if the air had shifted and she felt the balance of power slipping. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, caught between familial loyalty and the undeniable truth now before him. The tension was nearly palpable. I could see their plan unraveling, thread by thread, before my eyes. I had anticipated every manipulation, every guilt-laden remark, every subtle threat, and now the stage was set for their final reckoning. Callista stepped closer, attempting to regain control. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone sharp but brittle. "Surely you understand that family is about compromise. You don't need to go to these lengths." But I was ready for this. Calmly, I reached for the recorder I had discreetly activated earlier, the faint click filling the room. "Compromise is only meaningful when there's honesty, Callista, and there has been none. I will not allow deceit to define my place in this family or dictate my choices any longer." My words rang with certainty, a signal that the game had changed. Mark's hands twitched at his sides. "Raya, he began, faltering under the weight of evidence and the realization that he could no longer hide behind his mother's schemes. I gave him a measured look, silent but firm, and he understood immediately that this was a turning point. He had witnessed her attempts, her manipulation, and now he was facing the consequences alongside her. Callista's face hardened, a final attempt at intimidation flashing in her eyes. "Do you really think you can just expose everything and walk away unscathed?" she asked, voice low but venomous. I smiled slightly, a confident, almost serene expression. "It's not about walking away unscathed," I replied. "It's about reclaiming truth, asserting boundaries, and ensuring that manipulation no longer governs this household. Every move you make from here will be transparent, observed, and met with clarity." At that moment, I revealed the final piece of my preparation, a set of signed documents and witness statements confirming every misstep and attempt at coercion. The room went silent. Even Callista's sharp intake of breath couldn't hide the shock. Mark's shoulders slumped, caught in a web of truth he could no longer ignore. I could see their powerlessness, the realization that they had overplayed their hand, and it filled me with quiet satisfaction. For once, the game was fully in my hands. The confrontation escalated as other family members, drawn by the heightened tension, lingered in the background. Their eyes darted between us, some with curiosity, some with apprehension. Alliances shifted subtly in the dimly lit room. Siblings exchanged knowing glances, cousins whispered under their breath, and Mark's internal conflict became almost tangible. The household, previously bound by silent manipulation, now stood on the cusp of reckoning. Callista's last-ditch effort to sway the evening failed spectacularly. Every threat, every insinuation, every calculated look I had anticipated and countered. I watched as the realization dawned on her. Her schemes had not only failed, but had exposed the full extent of her overreach. I spoke quietly but firmly, letting my presence dominate the room. "The time for covert manipulation is over. I am aware, prepared, and unwavering. You no longer have the power to dictate my choices or undermine my position. Let this be clear. By the time the evening shadows deepened, the family had settled into an uneasy quiet. The property and financial issues had been addressed, legal matters clarified, and the balance, though fragile, restored. Mark looked at me with a mix of guilt and tentative respect, while Callista's proud mask had cracked irreparably. Other family members, witnessing the display of resolve, began reconsidering their own positions and loyalties. Apologies were whispered, alliances shifted, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of truth restored. I stepped toward the front door, taking a deep breath as the night air brushed against my face. Justice had been served, yes, but the emotional scars remained. The confrontation had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, yet I had emerged stronger, more aware, and fully in command of my life and decisions. The house was quiet now, but I knew the healing process would be gradual, the repercussions lingering. Every choice moving forward would define the next chapter of our lives. The morning sun brought warmth, but also a reminder. Some wounds heal slowly, and some lessons take a lifetime to learn. I lingered by the window, watching the soft light spill over our yard, and felt the weight of the previous night still resting on my shoulders. The house was quiet. Too quiet, in a way that spoke of tense reconciliations and unspoken questions. The papers from last night's showdown still lay neatly stacked on the dining table, a testament to both the chaos we had endured and the order I had reclaimed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, inhaling the aroma, and allowed myself a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. Walking through the house, I noticed the subtle changes left behind in the aftermath. The living room, once a battlefield of tension and whispered threats, now seemed hollow but stable. Broken furniture had been repaired, vases replaced, and even the small dents in the walls, remnants of arguments and heated movements, felt like silent witnesses to the transformation underway. Each step I took was measured, conscious of both my presence and the lingering shadows of past conflicts. It felt strange, almost surreal, to move through spaces that had been filled with manipulation, fear, and silent power struggles, and now were filled with quiet possibility. I went to the office to check the documents once more, ensuring every piece of evidence, every signed letter, every legal form was accounted for. My mind traced each conversation, each calculated step, and I felt a sense of quiet triumph. Callista, my mother-in-law, would face social and, if necessary, legal consequences for her manipulative actions. Mark, my husband, had begun the slow journey of acknowledging his complicity and attempting to make amends. The path ahead was far from smooth, but the clarity brought by truth had already begun to reshape the family dynamics. By mid-morning, I received a few cautious messages from close relatives. My sister-in-law reached out first, her tone tentative but sincere. "Raya, I see now what has been happening. I'm sorry I didn't realize sooner," she admitted. I replied carefully, choosing words that balanced honesty with compassion. "It's been difficult, but it's a chance for all of us to reset." Healing takes time. Other family members followed suit, each conversation a delicate dance of acknowledgement, explanation, and tentative reconciliation. It was encouraging to see small bridges being built where previously there were only walls. As the afternoon progressed, I moved to organizing the household and my own schedule, deliberately creating a sense of order to counterbalance the months of chaos. Every decision I made reinforced boundaries that had been ignored for too long. Financial matters were reviewed, and certain responsibilities reassigned, giving me both control and reassurance that the family's future would not be dictated by manipulation. I felt an emerging sense of independence, a deep understanding that personal strength was built through patience, preparation, and the courage to act decisively when necessary. Mark eventually joined me in the living room, hesitant at first, but with a visible desire to bridge the gap. "Raya, I know I made mistakes," he said quietly. "I want to make this right, if you'll let me." I studied him, noticing both the guilt and the sincerity in his eyes. "Acknowledging it is the first step," I replied. "Rebuilding trust will take effort from both of us." I am willing to move forward, but it has to be honest and consistent. His nod was tentative but promising, a subtle acknowledgement of the long road of personal redemption he had to travel. Evening approached, and I decided to host a small family gathering, a chance to gently normalize interactions while maintaining control of the environment. We shared a simple meal on the patio, the setting sun casting warm hues across the yard, softening tensions. Conversations were careful, respectful, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm observation rather than defensive readiness. Some relatives remained reserved, unwilling to fully engage, while others cautiously opened up. The balance was delicate but hopeful. Throughout the day, I reflected on my own growth. I realized that the battles fought in legal offices, living rooms, and between whispered confrontations had fortified my understanding of boundaries, trust, and personal strength. I no longer relied solely on reaction. I could anticipate, plan, and act with clarity. I had reclaimed the agency that had been undermined, and the lessons learned were now part of the foundation on which I would build the next chapter of my life. Even the lingering emotional threads, the subtle pangs of anger or betrayal, served as reminders of resilience, not weakness. A gentle breeze stirred as dusk settled over the Texas skyline, and I found myself sitting quietly in the backyard, the scent of evening flowers mingling with the faint hum of cicadas. I thought of the opportunities now available, the independence I had carved, and the relationships cautiously mending. There was hope, anchored in realism, and a quiet acknowledgement that some healing would always be gradual. I allowed myself a moment to plan the next steps, career projects long postponed, social engagements that nourished my spirit, and personal commitments that affirmed my autonomy. By the time darkness fell, I stood on the porch, surveying the calm home and the subtle glimmers of restored family balance. Justice had been achieved, yes, but the true triumph was the reclamation of self, dignity, and foresight. I had faced deception, manipulation, and betrayal, and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace what life would bring next. The journey was ongoing, but for the first time in a long while, the path forward felt deliberate, steady, and full of possibility. Before we wrap up, remember, this story isn't just about betrayal or revenge, it's about knowing your worth, setting boundaries, and standing up for yourself even when those closest to you try to undermine you. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to reclaim control of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more real-life stories of resilience, courage, and empowerment.